See, on the hill of Calvary, my Savior bled for me. My Jesus set me free. Look at the wounds that give me life, grace flowing from his side. No greater sacrifice. What he's done, what he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. Sing for the freedom he has won. Even death is dead and done. His life has overcome. Sing, say the name above all names, over every broken place. He is risen from the grave. What he's done, what he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. Now, on the throne of majesty, the Father's will complete. He reigns in victory. Sing hallelujah to the King. He is worthy to receive all the worship we can bring. What he's done, what he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. What he's done. What he's done. All the glory and the honor to the Son. My sins are forgiven. My future is heaven. I praise God for what he's done. I praise God for what he's done. I praise God for what he's done.
This is kind of a fun time of year for me because I'm one of those guys that believes, and some of you may strongly disagree with what I'm about to say. You may even consider it heresy. I believe on November 1st, you can start listening to Christmas music. And so it's been an exciting week to really start curating my Christmas playlists and listening to that stuff. I try to do it in October, but the kids get mad at me, and so I wait until November 1st. And because it's the time to start listening to Christmas music, it's also time to maybe start throwing in a Christmas movie or two. Now, some of you are like, oh, I hate these kinds of people, but I'm just saying I do, and I haven't watched one yet, okay, judgy people, but it's almost time. And a couple of my favorite Christmas villains that everybody knows about, of course, are Scrooge and the Grinch, right? Now, he's not here, today, but we had the Grinch come visit us a couple years ago. Grant Goodman, you can't even tell who he is. Grant was here. I mean, there's something about these characters that, even though they're villains, they're endearing to us just for fun. I mean, you got all the different movies, the ways that these have been portrayed in real person, in cartoon, again, both of them. I mean, I love Mickey's Christmas Carol. It's probably my favorite. All different ways these have been portrayed just for fun. The Christmas Carol or How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which one's your favorite? By show of hand, who prefers the, what's it called? What's the Scrooge? The Scrooge one. Who prefers the Scrooge one? Christmas Carol. Okay, how many prefer the Grinch Stole Christmas? Ooh, the Grinch, I think, wins. Anyway, here's what's kind of crazy about these two stories is I don't know if you ever thought about this before, these two characters are pretty similar. They both are mean and stingy and in some ways even cruel, but throughout the story of the movie, hopefully I'm not spoiling this story, surely you've seen these. By the end of the movie, both of them have their hearts changed, and all of a sudden they turn into these very generous people, and they go from selfish to selfless. And it's an amazing story. We love when hearts are changed and people change, and we're challenged by that and motivated by that. But it's easy to see selfishness in these sorts of characters. It's easy to see selfishness in other people, isn't it? It's when you see it, you just know it, and we say things like, when it's just obvious, we say things like, wow, he is so selfish. Or she, man, we see the destruction it causes in a relationship, and we're like, wow, she can be so selfish sometimes. But here's the crazy thing about selfishness. Even though it's easy to see, it's really easy for it to slip into our lives and it's not even realizing. I mean, think about the different ways we might describe selfishness and selflessness. And again, you see this in other people. It's easy to judge in other people, but selfish talks more than listens. Selfless listens more than talks. Selfish posts for likes. Selfless serves without being seen. Selfish asks, what can I get? Selfless asks, what can I give? Selfish person, maybe you've known somebody like this, needs to win every argument. The selfless person isn't out to win. They'll let other people shine. The selfish person keeps score. Always keeping score. The selfless person keeps serving. Selfish walks past need. Selfless stops and helps. Selfish is trying to be the goat. But the selfless person is pointing to Jesus. And I don't know about you, but as I look at this list, it kind of stings a little bit. If you were to reflect on your life over the past week, have any of these characteristics of selfishness popped up in your life? It's pretty easy for these sorts of characteristics, for selfishness to creep into our lives. And this morning, I want to step away from the Gospel of John. I try to do this on these kind of big Sundays, step away from the series since several of you aren't here as we walk through the Gospel of John, and explore something a little different. And I want to explore Luke chapter 19 this morning and a story of someone who goes from selfishness to selflessness. Now, the reason I put this verse on the screen is because it reminds us just how destructive selfishness can be. That's why this is important, right? Sure, we can see the danger, or we can see it in other people, but we need the reminder sometimes that to be selfish is not just an ordinary thing. It's not something that's harmless. It is incredibly harmful. Here's what James 3 verse 16 says. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, where there's selfishness, there will be disorder in every vile practice. Here's what I'm guessing. I'm guessing you've seen this at some point in your life. You've seen the destruction that selfishness can cause. So what do we do about it? Like I said, we're stepping away from John, and we're going to explore Luke chapter 19, famous passage. It's been a long time since I've preached from it. The story of Zacchaeus. So if you have your Bibles, turn over to Luke chapter 19, and we'll learn from a guy, I think, that goes from selfish to selfless. Not to give away the story quite yet. Luke chapter 19, let's pick up in verse 1. He, that's Jesus, entered Jericho and was passing through. All right, so Jesus is passing through Jericho. And there was a man named Zacchaeus. So we get a name of a guy, and a lot of times in the Gospels, we don't get a whole lot of description. We get a little description of maybe what they're... We get a pretty good description of this guy. He was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. All right, so those are two important descriptions. In the Gospels, 7 times you find the phrase, and we're going to find it here in a few minutes down in verse, well, it actually doesn't show up in this passage, but you find this phrase 7 times in the Gospels where the sinners and the tax collectors are referred to together. It's Jesus hung out with the tax collectors and the sinners. That's how in ancient Jewish culture, they viewed tax collectors who collected taxes for the Romans. They were so bad and so greedy and such a traitor to the Jewish faith and the Jewish culture that they got lumped in with the sinners. And they got their own category. I mean, you got over here the murderers and the adulterers and the thieves, and they all just get lumped under sinners, but you got the sinners and the tax collectors. And this guy isn't just an ordinary tax collector, which would be bad enough. He was the chief tax collector. Sometimes we talk bad about pyramid schemes, right? And you think about someone who starts a pyramid scheme and you think, man, that is a sorry person right there. That's how this guy would have, he was the top of the pyramid scheme of tax collecting. So all the tax collectors ripped people off by collecting tax, not just ripped people off, but they collected taxes for the Romans, which is viewed as being a traitor. But this guy, so they did it, but now he's like collecting money from them. He's at the top of the pyramid scheme and collecting taxes for the enemies of the Jews, the Romans. Right? And so this guy would have been viewed very negatively. Think about somebody, and you shouldn't have somebody maybe in your hometown or wherever you're from, or maybe a politician. Think about that person or politician that really just drives you crazy, and just to see them kind of causes these feelings to rise up inside your heart. That's how people would have viewed Zacchaeus. Nobody likes Zacchaeus. And to add on to all of it, because he's been successful at collecting taxes and in the process ripping people off, the text says he was rich. But he was also short. Look at the next verse, 3. And he was seeking to see who Jesus was. So maybe we learned something about him. Though he's a pretty sorry guy, and most people wouldn't have thought very highly of him, he wants to see Jesus. I wish I had some backstory. I wish I knew what was going on in his heart that caused him to want to see Jesus. Maybe his heart was drawn to Jesus for good reasons. Maybe he was just a pure spectator and had heard some about Jesus and he was coming through, but he wants to see Jesus. But on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was small of stature. So he's a short guy. There's a lot of people, and he can't see Jesus. Now, most of you know the story. If this is new to you, this is pretty fun. What happens next? Verse 4. And I know you're wanting to sing it and like march him up your arm, but we're not doing it. We're not singing it. So he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was about to pass that way. So he is so desperate, if you will, to see Jesus, and he can't see over the crowds. He actually climbs a tree. I know, it's a childhood story, it may be one of your favorites, but it's crazy to think he actually gets up in a tree so that he can see Jesus coming. Now again, imagine the kind of guy this is and the way he would have been viewed and the way we even view him after this description. Sure, maybe Jesus is going to be kind to him, but this is not the kind of person who will respond positively to the message of the gospel. These are the kind of people who maybe they want to see Jesus, but they don't really care. They're not really capable of changing because they're just that low down, right? They're just that sorry. But watch what Jesus does. Verse 5. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, can you imagine being in Zacchaeus' shoes? Like you're trying to lay low, but you're up in a tree because you can't see otherwise. But maybe there's branches. Maybe you're kind of hidden in the tree. But you don't actually want you just want to see Jesus. You don't want an interaction. And all of a sudden, Jesus turns up and looks at you in the tree. Maybe you're embarrassed because you're actually is there anybody else in Jericho in a tree right now? Like you may be the only person who's literally climbed a tree to see Jesus, and now he points you out. He looked up and he said to him, Zacchaeus, have you ever thought about that? He called him by name. He knows your name. Even if you haven't called on his name in a while, he knows your name. He said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down. I must stay at your house today. Now, even from our perspective, 2,000 years later, this is shocking. That Jesus would intentionally choose to speak to this kind of person and choose to go to his house. Now, we root for the poor person, and Jesus interacted with poor people all the time, and we talk about that, and we're like, yeah, Jesus elevated those on the margins and those who were poor, but here, he even elevates the rich guy and chooses to interact with the guy who ripped people off and made himself rich in the process. Verse 6, so he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. He doesn't get weird about it. He's excited. He receives Jesus joyfully. And when they saw it, they all grumbled. He's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. Would you have at least thought the same thing? Maybe you wouldn't have said it out loud. But would you have thought, of course, he goes to that guy's house. Verse 8. We don't really get Jesus' response to that thought process. But here's what happens when Zacchaeus and Jesus are in the house together. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor. Can you imagine what that looked like? When after one interaction with Jesus, Zacchaeus says, you know what? I'm going to give half of my stuff to poor people. How many lives in Jericho were changed that day because Zacchaeus said, I'm going to give half of my stuff. He was rich, the text says it. Isn't that crazy to think about the lives changed in this moment? And if I have defrauded anybody, this is middle of verse 8, anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold. Can you imagine somebody that Zacchaeus had ripped off, and since he had ripped them off, they'd been struggling financially. Maybe they barely had enough to eat. Maybe they'd had to kind of move to a different place, and they had struggled and struggled and struggled, and now Zacchaeus says, whatever I took from them, I'm going to give them 4 times what I took. Again, how many lives were changed after Zacchaeus' life was changed by Jesus? It's amazing that we focus rightly so on Zacchaeus and Jesus, but think about the lives that are changed after Zacchaeus' life is changed. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, since he also is the son of Abraham, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now there's a lot that could be said about that last statement, the reason Jesus came. We could focus on Jesus and his focus on people on the margins, and how he gives a guy who nobody else would have given him a chance, he gives him a chance to change, and he does change. But I want us to think about this story today from the perspective of selfishness and selflessness. Think about the changes that occur in the life of Zacchaeus just in this short story. He had climbed a tree just to get a glimpse of Jesus. And by the end of the story, he's hosting Jesus at his table. Pretty big difference. He, at the beginning of the story, is described as a greedy, well, the assumption is, as a tax collector, and the fact that he's stolen stuff from people, he's a greedy tax collector. By the end of the story, he's a generous giver. I almost didn't put that statement on the screen because I thought, well, no, he was just returning people's stuff that wasn't theirs in the first place. No, he actually says, half my stuff I'm going to give to the poor. He's turned in a moment from greedy to generous, from alone, because nobody probably likes him, finding belonging as a disciple of Jesus. He goes from selfish to selfless. And what is it that distinguishes one side of the screen from the other? What's the difference? What happened? And the simple answer is Jesus, isn't it? That's the Sunday school answer. It maybe sounds cliche, but it's so true. What causes this incredible transformation from selfish to selfless in Zacchaeus is very clearly the fact that Jesus has now come into his life. And so as I read this story and think about what it takes to go from selfish to selfless, I think the answer is pretty obvious. When Jesus moves into someone's life, selfishness moves out. When Jesus moves in, selfishness at least should move out. Because that's the kind of transformative power Jesus has over our lives when we allow him to move in. Now maybe here's the key. If you feel like, you know what, maybe I look back and selfishness has not moved out of my life, there will still be traces of selfishness in every person's life. We all struggle with this. I'm sure you could think of something this week that you did or a response that you had and you think, man, That was just that little bit of selfishness that still exists in me. But if you look at your life and you think, wow, there's a lot of selfishness still here, maybe it's the case that you believed in Jesus, maybe you even were baptized, but you didn't really let Jesus move into your life. You kind of let him stay out on the front porch. Because I want him around, I want the blessings of having Jesus around, but I don't necessarily want the change that he calls me to if I let him move in. See, the New Testament is clear about followers of Jesus being transformed to be the kind of people who are no longer centered on self. 2 Corinthians 5:15, in a passage is describing the redeeming work of Jesus, describes him in this way, and he, Jesus, died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves. That's selfishness, isn't it? And it's so easy to do, and it's what most people in our world do. We live for ourselves, but Jesus died so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him, who for their sake died and was raised. It's a move from selfishness to selflessness. Or Galatians 2 verse 20. Now this is in context of a debate about the Jewish law and whether Christians are saved by faith or saved by the law, but this is a beautiful verse. You know it well. I've been crucified with Christ, so I've died to myself. It is no longer I who live. When you become a follower of Jesus, Paul says, I'm not the one living here anymore. It's no longer I who live. That's selfishness. But Christ who lives in me, selflessness. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, not by my own power, who loved me and gave himself for me. And then our passage that was read during the scripture reading. Now I want to skip to the end of the passage, well, at least the beginning of the next passage. Verse 5 says, and have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus. And then he goes on to describe the incredible humility and selflessness of Jesus Christ. What's it look like to be like Jesus? And I think the answer is found in verses 3 and 4. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you not look only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Right? The clear biblical value is we are called to be people of selflessness, not selfishness. And so when Jesus moves in, selflessness moves out. Now it's easy to say that, and this is not an uncommon, we talk about selfishness and selflessness in our families and with our kids. What's this look like on a really practical level? What's this look like on a daily basis? All right, let me just give you some ideas, some thoughts. So let's start with, sorry to pick on the teenagers and kids, but let's start with the teenagers and kids and then kind of move on it, because here's the deal. It doesn't matter if you're 6 or 60. Selfishness is a temptation, isn't it? It's easy to allow it to sneak into our lives. So let's start here. Maybe at home, selfishness says, why isn't dinner ready, Mom? Selflessness says, how can I help with dinner? As you go to school and interact with other people, maybe selfish is, how can I get noticed? How can I get other people to see how good I am and how can I get noticed? Selfless says, who can I encourage? As you interact online, selfish says, how can I get more followers? How can I get more attention? Selfless says, how can I reflect Jesus here in my online spaces? As you interact with friends, maybe just by the way you text, selfish says, they didn't text me back. Selfless says, maybe they're having a hard day, I ought to check in again. See, in every area of life, it's easy for selfishness to kind of bleed into our lives. But this isn't just about kids, obviously. This is all of us. So in our marriages, selfish says, I deserve better. Selfless says, how can I love them better? At your workplace, selfish says, look what I did. Selfless says, what we did. It's not about me, look what we did. As you think about what it looks like to lead, I just saw this graphic this week. Look at the graphic. Pay attention pretty closely to this graphic. On the top, you've got the kind of boss who is selfish. Do what I say. Probably had a boss like that a time or two, haven't you? But on the bottom, you've got the kind of boss, it's not just a boss, but he's a leader. He goes out front, he gets involved, and he says, follow my lead. We've got some people in here who are supervisors, managers, bosses. What kind of boss are you? Are you a selfish boss or a selfless boss? As you think about your interactions with church, selfish says, people don't talk to me. Selfless says, I'll be the one to reach out. Or selfish says, the church is here to serve me and meet all of my needs, and get irritated when they don't plan enough stuff to meet my needs. Selfless says, the church is here to teach me to serve. And in our communities, isn't it easy to say, to let selfishness kind of take control and say, somebody should fix that? We've all said that before. And I get there's things that maybe we have no power to fix. Selflessness says, I don't know, maybe God put me here to fix that. You see, when Jesus comes into our lives and he pushes selfishness out, it changes the way we approach everything. Before Jesus moves in, it's what can I get? How can I take that selfishness, and it's so natural. But once Jesus moves in, changes everything, and the attitude is what can I give? How can I bless the people around me? Not what can I take, how can I bless? And so my challenge to you this morning is simply this: what's it going to look like for you to follow the example of Jesus? And here's what's beautiful about this. This isn't just like the Bible throwing out these commands. Hey, go be selfless. Live this ethical life of selflessness. No, you know where we learn to be selfless? We learn to be selfless from the one who gave himself up for us, died for us, became nothing for us, and taught us what it looks like. To not be selfish, but to be selfless. So what's it going to look like for you to move from selfishness to selflessness? Many of you are doing this so well, and you're a great example, but I'm guessing for the vast majority of us, sometimes we need the reminder that pushing selfishness out of our lives is an ongoing battle, and it can only happen when we put our faith completely in the one who can transform everything. As I think about these stories that we talked about at the beginning of the message, and we think about the change that occurred with Scrooge and the change that occurred with the Grinch. Do you remember how the end of the Grinch story ends? In fact, maybe not in the movies, but the book especially has this line. At the very end, with what happened, it says, well, in Whoville, they say the Grinch's small heart grew 3 sizes that day. And it's this beautiful image of someone going from selfishness to selflessness, and it's as if their heart grew. I've never really thought about just how much Scrooge and the Grinch parallel with Zacchaeus, and even in our own lives. You see, when we're selfish, our heart is small, and it's only full of self. It's all about me, 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 and there's no room for anything else. See, the Grinch and Scrooge, those are just stories, but Zacchaeus is the story of real change that occurs when Jesus comes in. Because when we allow Jesus to move into our hearts, it's as if he allows our hearts to grow. And now with Jesus, and when I've pushed selfishness out, there's room not just for Jesus, but there's room for everybody else. There's room for family and church and friends and neighbors and coworkers and classmates. And there's room even for the people that we didn't pay attention to before, we didn't even like before. There's room for the poor and our enemies and our rivals and everybody else. And this only is possible when we let Jesus come in, push out the selfishness, and open up the room for everybody else. In Zacchaeus' case, the day Jesus changed the heart of Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus then started changing the world around him. And again, this is the part I never thought of. Isn't it amazing to think of all of the lives that changed in Jericho the day that Jesus changed Zacchaeus' life? Poor people are now receiving like they'd never received before. People who had been ripped off are now having 4 times what they were ripped off given back to them. The day Jesus changed the heart of Zacchaeus, he started changing the world around him. And isn't the same true for us? When you go from selfish to selfless, Jesus doesn't just change your life. He uses your life to change others. So this week, who in your life at home, at work, at school, in your neighborhood or down your road, who could have their lives changed by your selflessness? Because first, Jesus changed your life. Today, if you need to let Jesus in so that he can push some of that other stuff out, we would love to help you get to know him as we stand and sing together.
There is beyond the azure blue